there are principles and practices which we may call Euro-Atlantic norms, which all of the allies do agree on. And I think these are valuable for Ukraine to take into account as it continues on its reform path. The key values and the key principles I would like to underline include transparency, of course, fair and open competition, proper parliamentary oversight, and effective public-private partnerships. And we are happy to see Ukraine committing to applying these principles in its own reform effort. I would also highlight the effort of Ukroboronprom to pursue corporatization and to fight corruption as being a laudable effort, should be praised. It requires determination and support also from the political leadership. So I'm glad that on this panel we see that embodied. And of course, for this effort to succeed, and we have all the reasons to believe it will, actions should be taken step by step, but should be taken in a continuous manner. Those actions should involve both the corporate level, the corporation as such, and of course also at the individual level, from the CEO down to the employees of the corporation. Another principle I think that we would support is that reform efforts should be properly and openly communicated. That's a very important part of the reform effort as such, and it will bring a new culture, we think, across the system. Then reform of the industry should be and is an inherent part of the wider reform effort of the security and defense sector as such, which of course NATO is also proud to support. So in order to succeed, I think the reform of Ukroboronprom needs to be integrated into the broader transformation picture. I would also highlight the importance of appropriate legislation. Clearly in Ukraine, there was a milestone achieved back in 2018 with the adoption of the law on national security. It required, of course, the adoption of a range of secondary legislation, which we saw in this sphere last year with the adoption of the law on defense procurement. Of course, all legislation, in order to be effective, needs to be implemented. And here we know that there are some challenges that you face with the implementation of this new legislation, and we would like to encourage all Ukrainian stakeholders to make sure that this good legislation is actually implemented at the earliest opportunity. And I think when we speak about investments, we should also remember what the main added value is of Ukraine's defense industry. And when I speak to colleagues who work on these issues on a day-to-day basis in Brussels at NATO headquarters, their response is unequivocal. It's the exceptional expertise that you have here in Ukraine, and particularly in the enterprises, in the companies that constitute Ukroboronprom. So this is something that should be, of course, cherished and preserved, and at the same time modernized, because technology, of course, evolves as we speak, and new technologies are emerging, some of which may prove disruptive for the armed forces, for the way we operate, for the way we fight. Things like artificial intelligence, big data analytics, machine learning, all of these processes have an impact not only on defense, but also on our wider societies. And I think the modernization of Ukroboronprom shall take these into consideration. I'd also like to make a point about Ukraine's participation in NATO activities, which I believe brings value and benefit to both sides. For example, interaction in the framework of the Conference of National Armaments Directors, the CNAD, the NATO Science and Technology Organization, as well as other bodies and formats like the Joint Working Group on Defense Technical Cooperation. I think all of these platforms provide opportunities for exchanges of ideas and solutions. And of course, all of these are possible by reducing the spectrum for corruption and by building integrity into the reform process. And this leads me to my final point, which is about building integrity. And it was mentioned this afternoon in the opening session by my Deputy Secretary General. The Building Integrity Program is NATO's flagship anti-corruption program, which works on strengthening integrity in defense and related security sector institutions, including through its public-private partnership initiative. And so what BI does is it provides analysis on integrity frameworks at the national level through a self-assessment and a peer review process. And so this process includes a part on engagement with defense companies and other suppliers. And Ukraine completed this self-assessment back in 2019. And on the basis of that, the NATO side submitted a report with recommendations to Ukraine during the visit of the North Atlantic Council to Ukraine, which took place 2019. So this report has actually been made public by Ukrainian stakeholder institutions, which I think is a very welcome step. And it offers several high-level sectoral policy recommendations that are expected to have cross-cutting effects on integrity and performance of defense and security institutions. And several of these recommendations touch on relations between the public and private sectors, such as improving the procurement system that is in place, in particular through limiting non-competitive, secret, and extraordinary procurement procedures. So I think from our perspective, the implementation of these recommendations would be an important first step towards addressing corruption risks and in parallel building investment opportunities. So I would once again like to commend Ukraine's efforts in this regard, and we expect that NATO-Ukraine cooperation in this sphere will help Ukraine make further progress. So I think I'll stop here and we'll be happy to engage in further discussion.
Дуже дякую.
Right, thank you very much. Mr. Alexander, you mentioned corporate governance, and this brings me to the representative of the Ukrainian government, Oleg Uruskyy, who is the first Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine for Strategic Industries of Ukraine. This is a new ministry, new agency, established just last summer, and this is a new post. So, as a public servant, what's your take on the issues raised by Mr. Vinnikov that there is corporate governance in NATO member states? Would you say that in the Ukrainian context, is corporate governance helping overcome corruption? When the public officials run companies, is it creating corruption risk? Or is corporate governance working differently in Ukraine and NATO?
Thank you, Olena. I would like to welcome everybody. I would like to thank for the invitation for this wonderful event. Actually, the problem of the defense industry of Ukraine and its reform, of course, are of concern for specialists, experts, and the society in general. And this is well known from the social networks, the feedback that we receive, and the response to certain events. I would like, first of all, I would like ourselves to get back to the history, because the reform of the defense industry is long expected, and it's even overdue. We should have started with it much earlier. I believe that after disintegration of the former Soviet Union, we have inherited over 1,000 enterprises, which to a certain extent were affiliated with the defense industry of the former Soviet Union, various agencies which comprised the defense sector. Of course, actually, those enterprises were not actually very important for the new country. And yet, those companies had the experience of their own. Ukraine gained both positive and negative experience of the change of the systems of different companies that were owned by the government 100%. If you analyze, we shall see that we have experience of 100% privatization of companies. As an example, I would like to quote the well-known company, which is known to everyone, which is Moderator, which in 1990s, back in 1990s, privatized. And nowadays, the government does not have any stake in that company, which is 100% private. And it has developed in its own way, in its own pace. Everything looked fine. They had the orders, and they demonstrated good financial results. Economics was fine. Compared to quite many government-owned companies, that company has demonstrated the change of ownership form caused positive things. Yet, some moment came when it has sustained problems related to drawbacks in the national legislation. I will not take much time to analyze that. Probably some people know it, and still this analysis is ahead of us, because actually, maybe with a certain threat of hostile acquisition, because the company was not protected by the government, those things happened that have happened. And the government could not adequately respond to that. And now we have some relations not only inside the country and also with external world. Another issue, shall we quote the company Pivdenmash, Yuzhmash, compared to starting conditions of Moderator, it had quite similar principles. They had the same starting conditions, including the number of employees, including the output. And nowadays, Pivdenmash, Yuzhmash, if to compare with Moderator, those are different weight categories. I will not analyze the reasons, and yet, inter alia, this was inefficiency of management, in particular, of that particular company. Coming back to the issue of reform, of course, the government of Ukraine fully supports the reform of the defense industry, and those activities began last year after the state property fund, by government decision, has received some companies which were formerly part of Ukroboronprom, and they were given for privatization. Nowadays, there is a common vision of all the stakeholders about the future shape of our defense industry. I just speak of the government component, not touching the private sector, which nowadays also plays a substantial role in our overall condition of the defense industry, which is only at the stage of formation as a defense industry of the independent country of Ukraine. Therefore, we have prepared the regulatory framework, regulatory and legal framework. Most probably today we shall discuss the draft law, which 3822, which is now in Parliament, and also the future form of governance of companies. I would like to say that no doubt corporate governance is a way that any corruption component, as we talk about, would be reduced. If to speak of ourselves and Ukraine, efficient supervisory boards, which are actually the indicators, and they're mirroring corporate governance, do not exist. They don't exist because Motorsic, if they have had a well-functioning supervisory board, would not come to that particular situation where the company finds itself in. The same is true about the companies with functioning supervisory boards. We have a sufficient number of joint stock companies that have supervisory boards, and the state concern Ukroboronprom has a supervisory board, and quite many companies, including in the aerospace, which are part of the Ukroboronprom, have also supervisory boards. However, I don't think that today they became the real preventer against corruption attempts. Speaking of the corruption component in the defense industry, this is about disposal of properties of those companies and also appointment of management, as management has access to disposal of such properties. Those are the main corruption components, which also cause quite a number of criminal cases related to illegal sale of properties and so on. Not only sale, also during restructuring and also during reform, people commit such things. Therefore, no doubt, the reform which was initiated, it was not it's for the sake of reform. It was made to make our defense industry integral, as it is facing its assignment. The assignment number one is to provide the armed forces with leading armaments and equipment. Also strengthening also the exports component, because the situation is not really easy. You probably know of that, and probably you can see that. Being for 7 years in the condition of aggression from the part of the Russian Federation, we have to, I will not quote the percentage, but that's a dominating percentage, that's providing for the firearms with our own capabilities, because our partners, not all of them, not all of them are eager to supply lethal and non-lethal armament for our country. And that topic must also be discussed also with our partners, because this topic is serious and it is of concern for the society and the government agencies and the central government, because we must have integral picture. What can we count on? We are not capable from the financial perspective, and also based on the human resources. We cannot have the full cycle of the defense industry inside the country. We don't probably need it. And yet we have to clearly define for ourselves in which particular direction, whom of the partners can we develop the promising military and technical cooperation, to have joint developments of defense technology, or to have an opportunity to procure that armament and military equipment that we need to procure. From my side, I would like to underline that the government believes that the reform, including introduction of effective corporate governance as one of the main preventers of corruption and reduction of that corruption, minimizing corruption in the defense industry of Ukraine. It means that in the newly created companies, the supervisory boards will be formed in the holding companies that will be formed in the basic directions. Also, there will be supervisory boards. The Ministry for Strategic Industries is not going to interfere into the economic activities of such companies or directly directly influence appointment of management of companies that must become public joint stock companies within the defense sector. Those will be the issues of the supervisory boards, who will review economic policy and commercial activity, and also they will decide who will manage those companies.
Thank you. We'll go back to the issue of independence of steering boards, because the current law placed with the Parliament does not envisage that there will be more independent members of the board in the steering boards, but rather will be appointed by the government.
I believe this is appropriate on the current stage, because the government can give up, can fully surrender, especially under difficult conditions. The defense industry of any country, including the NATO countries, is a special sector where the government is focusing quite close attention on that. Therefore, formation of supervisory boards will be determined by the law, which is now in the Parliament. However, my vision that most of the members of supervisory board must represent the state.
Clearly so.
Yet there must be independent members.
And the procedure of electing the boards is another matter. I hope it's going to be done publicly and transparently, unlike it's been done today, when the steering boards are handpicked by the President and the Cabinet of Ministers. So, if we transition from the governmental and strategic issue to the matters of governance, Yuriy Husyev is the CEO of Ukroboronprom, and let's ask him about his prospects on what's going to happen when the law is enacted. So, in your opinion, if the law is enacted, what immediate outcomes should we look forward to? When will we see more investments and less corruption? As a practitioner, what's your take on it?
Thank you for this question, and also for the invitation, dear Olena, dear Alexander, dear Oleg. Indeed, the question of introduction of anti-corruption policies, anti-corruption system in the defense industry, this is, first of all, as I believe, the question of creating effective institutions. The law 3822 is focused on it. We're also looking forward for it in the second reading. Before the second reading, the draft law was supported by the committee. The corporatization began since I was appointed to that position. There was clear assignment of the President to provide for implementation of that reform. I have signed the relevant decree. Mr. Oleg remembered of the decision of the government, which happened after the decree, after my appointment to the cabinet, about transfer of some companies. Now we have started corporatization, and the foundation of it must be the draft law 3822 about the institutions. Indeed, the new institutions, the new rules, the new corporate governance, anti-corruption policy is part of creating efficient state defense industry. We are working actively on that. Now we have renewed supervisory board actively working these days. Last week there was a meeting of the renewed membership of the supervisory board, which is assigned to prepare and file for review of the supervisory board, which is expected in the coming weeks. as a plan of corporatization, as a plan of transformation of concern. Ukroboronprom will be transformed into modern joint stock companies that have to provide for corporate governance. The modern corporate governance in line with the principles that exist worldwide, in line with what is a common best practice in the defense companies of other countries. And today we say that as early as today we implement anti-corruption policies, we now implement anti-corruption programs. Tomorrow we have a meeting with the team together against corruption, and with it we develop a range of activities aimed at prevention of corruption. We have introduced a polygraph for all leaders of state-owned companies under their concern, and we do that regularly. In the same way, we have introduced compliance in the concern, and now we implement that system together with risk management and also together with the audit that we also hold as we involve the best leading companies. I would like to underline once again that with no transformation, without the challenge, creating new efficient institutions that would have supervisory boards and all necessary elements of the anti-corruption policy that would provide for transformation of what was created at the times of Yanukovych, which is today called state concern Ukroboronprom, which for quite many years was accompanied with corruption scandals and quite many other things, must be transformed into modern institutions, one of which must be the joint stock company defense systems of Ukraine, that will have to include relevant joint stock companies that will take care of implementation of development of maritime system, armored technology, radar system, missile system, munition sector, and we have to do all that in the future while involving the partners, providing for transparent, efficient transfer of technology. First of all, in order to support our armed forces with modern armament and technology and equipment, and to provide for innovative development of the state defense industry, so that in the future, in 5 and in 10 years, we would produce modern armament and equipment for Ukrainian armed forces that would match the challenges that we shall face in 5 or 10 years. Transfer of technologies, having joint projects and programs and companies with our international partners. There is great interest for that, and the President of Ukraine, while visiting a number of countries with official visits, is actively promoting the issue of military and technical military technology cooperation. It's important for us. This is transfer of technology, also access to global financial markets, also the opportunity to create the best samples of armament and technology. We produce the best, a range of best samples, including radar systems, including missile systems, including armored APC-4, armored personnel carrier, and we need to move forward, create cooperation with NATO countries, and we must integrate NATO standards into the defense industry. And this is part of this transformation that we do today by assignment of the President of Ukraine. Our next steps, and we expect that soon, that 822 will be approved. In the future, we shall need to approve jointly with support of international organizations and international partners the charter of the newly created companies, joint stock companies, that will be new institutions that will be created as a result of transformation of Ukroboronprom. Then it will be necessary for us to select very powerful members of supervisory boards so that in the future they can provide for implementation of what we need today for the defense industry, and what the President assigned to us to implement, especially to me, as I was appointed to this position. We are convinced that transformation of Ukroboronprom into modern new institutions will generate both the benefit for the defense industry, it will become the driver of the industry of our country, the driver for innovative development, the driver of technology transfer, and the driver for scientific and technical progress, because defense industry is a foundation for the armed forces, and the armed forces today receive attention of the state, and today with no armed forces we realize that the defense of our independence is not possible. Therefore, the defense industry has to develop while transforming, while implementing the new modern practices, including those in the anti-corruption policy.
Mr. Yuriy, thank you so much. You mentioned that once the law is enacted, the big transformation will start. It's already on the way. It started in December when I sent the relevant decree. Now we are making all the steps to take inventory, take stock, form new corporate strategy, and the steering board during the first renewed composition session is approving the transformation strategy, and we expect the National Defense and Security Council to review the strategy for the development of the defense industry complex, which will serve as an impetus for the development of our defense industry. And these are important fundamental steps the country has been waiting for 30 years. Exactly. Now I'd like to transition to Mr. Winter and pose the question to him. And he's the U.S. Strategic Advisor on Defense Industry Reform. And for a number of years, he's been following the reform in Ukraine. And as you've been saying, and as Mr. Uruskyy has been saying, we've been on the threshold of a breakthrough when the transformation will start that will propel the assets and corporatize. No, we are not on the threshold, we are crossing it. The State Property Fund has started privatizing some of the enterprises, like the Kherson Sudmash has been placed for privatization. A few months ago, it was still a part of Ukroboronprom. We are now taking every step to make sure that the adoption of the law will approximate us to the goal formulated by the President, and that is the creation of effective institutions with a modern corporate governance structure, with anti-corruption policy in place, with the technology transfer opportunities, investments, access to global financial markets, and equipping our armed forces with modern equipment and technology. No doubt, for sure, but my question addressed to Mr. Donald Winter is, since hopefully the reform is going to accelerate for Ukroboronprom, as the panelists have been saying, is long overdue. Mr. Winter, as a person who's been involved on behalf of the US government, how do you assess the progress made in this reform over the last years? And would you say, Mr. Winter, that we are to see the time when the American investors will have an interest in joint ventures with Ukroboronprom? Do you see Ukraine on the verge of major change, or do you perceive some risks? The Independent Defense Anti-Corruption Committee assessed that privatization, the transfer of assets, is potentially vested with some corruption risks. So our NATO partners and G7 partners have been following these processes closely. So, Mr. Winter, what would you say? You led the US Navy, but also you have a business background, having run the defense industry in the States. He was the head of the steering committee. So how would you compare your American expertise and the events unfolding in Ukraine? Are we on the way to investments? Are we on the right track?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate this evening. I believe I can best contribute by offering a personal perspective on corruption and how it can impact various international business arrangements. I should note this is a personal perspective that has been informed by my many years as a senior executive and as a corporate board member directly involved in such matters. Now, the challenges faced by Ukroboronprom motivate the consideration of a wide range of business arrangements with US and European companies. Ukroboronprom needs to rebuild their supply chain, replacing products previously procured from the Russian Federation. At the same time, they need to find new customers for items that they sold to the Russian Federation. And perhaps most importantly, Ukroboronprom needs to modernize their product offerings, their processes, and their facilities. All of this will require substantial investments of both financial capital and intellectual property, resources potentially available from Western companies. The business arrangements to do so will need to be approved by corporate management and, if they are significant, the boards of directors of those companies. This is a non-trivial matter. When I first took on this role nearly 3 years ago, I was told that all that would be needed to enable Western investment would be the establishment of a supervisory board for Ukroboronprom and the conduct of a proper audit. Unfortunately, that was a very naive perspective. And today, I worry that the focus on OECD compliance overly simplifies the problem. Now, please do not misunderstand me. OECD compliance is important, but while necessary, it is not sufficient. Getting a business arrangement approved by a Western corporation can be a formidable challenge. First and foremost, the question that must be answered is whether there is a viable business case providing a reasonable return, commensurate with the risks. One then has to ask, what is reasonable? This is typically defined by the alternative opportunities that are available to the corporation, as well as its cost of capital. In that regard, we should note that Western companies have many options for investment. But even if the returns look reasonable, the question that then must be asked is, what are the risks associated with the proposed business arrangement? I will note just a few that must be considered here this evening. First of all, what are the risks to the counterparty's viability and stability? What risks of business continuity exist that could impact the resilience of a corporation's supply chain? What are the legal risks to the corporation? In the US, we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, violations of which can be particularly onerous for defense contractors. And lastly, but not insignificant, is the potential for reputational risk. These risks emanate from two sources: rules of law and corruption. These are two separate but related factors. Rule of law is critical. It addresses the question as to whether legal agreements can be relied on and enforced, whether legal challenges will be used appropriately or abused, whether the courts will adjudicate according to the law, and whether the judgments rendered will be accepted and complied with. Now, in noting these questions, I have to ask, what does the failure to resolve the sea launch dispute with Boeing say about the rule of law in Ukraine? And in a not unrelated vein, I also note that the recent challenges to the Naftogaz board call to question the authority of Ukrainian boards and whether agreements approved by them will be enforced by the courts. Turning then to the issue of corruption, there are a similar list of questions that need to be asked. First of all, will illicit transactions violate US laws, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or compromise the return on investments? Is there an effective internal governance process that guards against such practices, such as an informed, capable, and empowered supervisory board? Finally, are external sources of corruption, such as those related to export and import licensing, controlled by law enforcement and by the courts? All of these have to be considered. Now, let me bring my comments to a close with a few summary remarks. First of all, given the current environment in Ukraine, I have to note that concerns regarding the rule of law and corruption create a high bar for investment by Western corporations. The U.S. government can help mitigate some risks, such as by providing political risk insurance, but the U.S. cannot mandate private companies to invest. They will have to be motivated by considerations of the return on investment. My net assessment is that to enable the needed investments by Western corporations, these problems are going to have to be attacked systematically by government and corporation leadership. Be pleased to engage in any further questions that you have. Thank you.
Дякую.
Thank you, Mr. Winter. Indeed, your remarks that the corporate governance and OEC standards are not enough for the reforms to succeed are very much welcome. This comment is very well accepted. I think this is generally accepted, but still, in Ukraine, there is a problem with the corporate governance standards, as this is a relatively new, novel concept for the country, and it's not taking root easily in the Ukrainian context. With us, we have Ms. Jill Sinclair, who is a Defense Reform Advisory Board member from Canada. Canada is a partner of Ukraine, assisting Ukraine with military assistance. And Ms. Jill Sinclair, for a number of years, has been involved in the reform of the Ukrainian defense sector overall, so we are very interested in hearing from her. Do you notice less corruption? Is the sector looking any better? She was involved in organizing the Toronto Ukraine Reform Conference in 2018 when the reform assessments were made. So we are very interested in hearing your opinion as a person who is involved at the strategic level. And going back to strategic governance issue, what is the role for women in the sector in defense industry governance? We don't see any women in the steering board in Ukroboronprom and others. There are few women at the top managerial level.
Against corruption and overall progress on reform. And I think I might start where Dr. Winter ended by saying I've seen many necessary, important, ground-changing reforms made. And these are all necessary, but they're not yet sufficient. So the important thing is to stay the course and to be systematic. Institutional reform that embeds the rule of law, not just as a theoretical piece of paper, but Governance is about putting in place the right habits, the right procedures, the right processes, including massive transparency and oversight in any sector in the public sector, but particularly in the defense and security sectors. And so this reform has to be embedded in the wider Ukrainian government's efforts to deal with judicial reform, new investment laws. As again, Dr. Winter said, things have to be reliable. There has to be a sense that the rule of law is working in an appropriate way, that there is compliance, that there is trust, and that there is confidence, and that we know in the area of corruption, perception is often reality. So you have to deal with not just the letter of how things are done, but the perception as to how those things are done. And it has to do with clarity of roles. And I really would encourage a lot of focus on the clarity of roles, whether it's in the private sector, in the discussion we're having here on Ukroboronprom, or for example, in the wider defense sector, where, for example, we are hoping that Ukraine will very clearly establish civilian control and accountability of the armed forces according to NATO standards. This is extremely important for putting out the right parameters about what Ukraine means by and expects from the rule of law, and that will be used by potential investors or confidence in their relationship with Ukraine. Before I address your question on women, I'd just like to say that, you know, corruption is not a sort of a nice thing to have. Anti-corruption, sorry, efforts are not a nice thing to have. They're at the very core of national security of a country. And I would just like to make sure that people have seen a recent directive that the United States brought out. Dawn, forgive me for speaking about something US, but it establishes the fight against corruption as a core US national security interest. Placing anti-corruption efforts at the core of Ukraine's national security interests is absolutely essential. It is core to resilience. On the issue of women and the role for women, look, my view is that Ukraine needs every competent, qualified, thoughtful, experienced person possible who has the courage to provide a challenge function, the courage to drive forward an ambitious agenda, the knowledge and experience to be able to risk manage issues to the benefit of Ukraine, whether private sector or public sector. And there's no doubt in my mind there are lots of qualified women in Ukraine to do that. Over.
Дякую, пані Джил.
Ms. Jill, thank you very much for your answer. Indeed, the defense industry sector in Ukraine calls out for leaders and men and women who'd be professional, even if some expertise is lacking. To give you an example, it could be in the area of compliance. There are few compliance experts in Ukraine. They mostly come from private sector. This is an evolving notion, and it's only making its way into the government sector. So we want to talk about success stories. And we brought in Fausto di Fant, who is a compliance officer for the Italian Leonardo company, which is the aeronautic giant based in Italy, where 30% is government-owned, which employs 50,000 staff, almost the same numbers as Ukroboronprom. And this very company has taken one of the highest places in the global rating on anti-corruption compliance. This is a rating published by our donor organization, Transparency International for Defense and Security, and your company scored very highly. So do we understand it correctly that your company in 2003 started implementing the corporate governance standards? And if you could explain, based on your experience, when you started on this path, when you started implementing these standards, started designing the risk management and compliance systems, how did it serve you in your business? Did you manage to attract more investments once you've become more transparent and reduce the corruption risks. This experience could be invaluable for Ukraine.
Thank you very much. First of all, I thank you for your kind and appreciated invitation to join this interesting session. First of all, I want to tell you my boss is a woman, is our senior compliance officer for the whole group, and is a very brilliant and appreciated woman. I've been working with Leonardo, the Italian defense company, for about 20 years. Currently, as you introduced me, I'm in charge of the so-called business compliance for our group, dozen of subsidiaries all over the world. The business compliance in our group is the appointment of sales agent, commercial advisors, distributors, etc., all over the world. So it is considered a strategic business leverage for us. Before mentioning in a few minutes the main building blocks of our anti-corruption system, in our experience, of course, I just want to underline a couple of very important issues. First of all, our system is not a result obtained once for all, but it is a process, it is a journey, it is a path in which we try to improve every day, taking the best from our daily experience. So we learned a lot over time, above all from our mistakes. This is a very important point. And another relevant issue is that we are ongoing, we are constantly under observation and in talk with external bodies and associations such as Transparency International, but also the Norwegian Council on Ethics. And this continuous confrontation with external association, it's very important. It's a huge stimulus to improve and to go on in our in the proper direction of integrity in business. So these a couple of issues are very important points to be considered before mentioning which are the major topics for our anti-corruption system. I want to underline also the fact the DCI result, in which we ranked first in the world for the first time in the band A, it was for us a huge result of our team working. We succeeded in involving something like 18 company functions in preparing documents and increasing the disclosure of our information, our the dedicated section in our websites, and so on. But we considered an important result due to team working. We had a dedicated, focused team, daily trying to involve all the colleagues and all the company functions. So, which are the 10 building blocks of our anti-corruption system? I just mentioned these 10 titles. First of all, organization. Over time, we succeeded in defining a focused organization with clear terms of reference, and now within our legal department, we have 3 dedicated functions. One is the function I belong to, the compliance functions, which has 2 souls. the trade compliance and the business compliance. Then we have an anti-corruption dedicated unit. And last but not least, we have another dedicated unit, which is called criminal law, ethics, and integrity. So over time, we built a very focused and dedicated organization and specialized units for any of the mentioned issues. Second key topic, assessment. We run annual assessment in which we check the compliance performance of all our business divisions and all our subsidiaries. And this is very important to improve, learning from our daily best practice and above all, I repeat, from our mistakes. Third, building blocks, training and training again. We use training program to keep not only our managers and our employees involved in the issue of compliance, ethics, and integrity, but we have specific online courses for all our third parties. If they do not follow and pass an examination at the end of these online courses, they cannot have an appointment as a business partner, distributor, or sales promoters or commercial advisors. So we are investing year after year a lot of money and attention in training. We have a very rich training program for all our managers and employees and for all our business partners. Again, another key issue is the risk culture, the risk approach. Over time, we developed specific tools in order to evaluate any proposal of appointments for this business partner or sales agents. We evaluate the proposal also under the risk dimension. We have a specific tool in which we evaluate dozens of red flags, such as, for example, reputation, the country level of corruption, the so-called CPI, the beneficial owners, bank account, international blacklisting, and so on. We check more than 40 red flags, and at the end we express for each proposal of appointment a specific risk level. We can have low risk, medium risk, and high risk. So this risk approach is fundamental in our system. Again, the compliance network. We have daily more than 300 people all over the world and professionals working in the compliance department to ensure the sustainability over time of our group business. So it's one of the strength points for our system, this international network of professionals. Then the due diligence activities is the core business of our daily job. Any single appointment is evaluated through different tools. For example, external report from business intelligence specialized providers, or for example, direct interview with the candidates, or against ongoing monitoring through activity report. So the due diligence is the core of our activity. We reach also important international certification of our system. Currently, we are under observation, under assessment for the renewal of this international certification we obtain according to an international standard called ISO 37001. Last but not least, which I consider the most relevant building block for our system, are people. I work for about 20 years in HR department, but no doubt if you have the right people, I mean motivated and skilled people, you can face also difficult challenges, as we did this year and in this period, facing the global pandemics. So the most important, to conclude, the most important building block are people, are our people, and so we try to do our best in a daily people caring. Thank you very much for your attention.
Дякую. Так, за
Thank you for your remarks. So building compliance system and taking on corruption is very expensive and labor-intensive endeavor. There are 300 people dedicated to the effort in your company, not to mention the same numbers in Ukroboronprom, but it's good that we are on it already. It's very good that you've already started this development. Now we have 20 minutes for the question and answer session from the audience. We've brought in representatives of the international community, the experts, politicians, and there are people joining us online as well. So if there are any questions, would you please post them? We have a free question and answer session now, and I'm happy to pose questions for my part, but I would like to give a chance to the audience. Let me start with the first question while people are collecting their thoughts. So we know that Mr. Fausto, representing Leonardo company, would confirm that it's taken that the steering board is in charge of compliance and anti-corruption endeavors. So I have a question addressed to Mr. Uruskyy, as he represents the government on this panel. How are we going to elect the crystal clear people to sit on the steering board that we can have trust in? Ms. Sinclair and Mr. Fausto Fant told us that trust is very important and perception is the key. So how do we find the people that we can believe in? And how can we tell them that we trust? You are leaving no leeway for corruption in our defense industry. What's your take on it?
I would like to make a small comment about gender policy. I agree that in the top leadership there are no ladies in Ukroboronprom, yet in our ministry nowadays over 50% are ladies. If we take the level of department directors, heads of divisions, we have parity between men and women. If to speak about deputy directors, of course, we have a lot to aspire for. I don't exclude that we also have ladies among the top management someday. How can we select the people whom can we trust? This is a very important issue, and this is urgent. Speaking about fighting against corruption, we must understand that just supervisory boards will not help to solve the issue. It's a comprehensive issue. I believe in our country it must be solved, starting from the reform of the judiciary, because whatever we fight in our narrow sector, unless this has continuation until logical completion, this will level down that struggle and it will never become effective. I believe civil society must participate. We are now about to complete the processes related to our civic council under the ministry. as a strategic sector of industry. People have filed the applications, now they undergo necessary procedures, and we shall form the civic council. It will be the active participant also in selecting candidates for positions in the supervisory boards. Of course, I don't know what is the final version of the draft law that will be adopted. If it will be allowed to have representatives of foreign countries on the supervisory boards, this question is still debated in the parliament. As I understand, we had quite a lengthy discussion with Mr. Donald Winter, and we have concluded that, of course, if to speak of theoretical possibility of participation of representatives of foreign partners in the supervisory board, at least in addition to professionalism, of course, those people must speak the official language, I mean Ukrainian. And of course, the process of selection of candidates to the supervisory boards is rather important. Also, the biography and other aspects. Of course, what people do will demonstrate what kind of people are they. They must have impeccable reputation, have relevant experience in that field, and have be reputable as an expert, authoritative as an expert. I don't believe it must be a jury. Those must be professionals and people having no corrupt activities in the past. And this is what we shall try to do. I don't know if we have sufficient people of that kind, because we need quite a number of supervisory boards to be formed, and we shall need quite many specialists of this kind.
Thank you. Are there any questions to the panelists? Are there any comments? We have 10 minutes remaining to the end of the panel. So would anyone else like to comment on the key questions raised today?
Andrei Stangret from Apostle TV channel. The question is about NATO, which was mentioned today. And the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, was saying that NATO must accept Ukraine. Also, he is talking about this to the President of US, Joe Biden. And the question is, how such statements of Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, is taken in the alliance, and how to assess Ukraine's progress towards NATO accession in the recent years. Thank you for this question.
Is that NATO's open door policy remains in place. We are very firmly committed to the principle that whereby any sovereign state can choose its own alliances. Also the Bucharest summit decision, which confirmed that Ukraine and Georgia will be members of NATO, it remains in force and has been confirmed by subsequent summit decisions. What allies expect Ukraine to focus on now is domestic reforms. We spoke about the reforms that are being pursued in the defense and security sector. Joining NATO is about the entire country joins NATO, not only security and defense institutions, and that's why it's so important that the other values and principles on which the alliance is based, democracy, rule of law, free market economy, human rights and fundamental freedoms, all of those values need to be fully in place in order for a country to join. So NATO supports very strongly the ambitious reform agenda of Ukraine, and over the past few years we see evidence of undeniable progress being made. At the same time, more work still remains ahead, and we are here also through the NATO representation in Kyiv to help our Ukrainian partners advance their Euro-Atlantic aspirations.
Дійсно, бачите, починали з НАТО, закінчуємо НАТО,
So this conversation started with NATO and is concluding with NATO. Ukrainians are so eager to join NATO that we are ready to reform the concepts of our defense industry. If we have any questions from the journalists joining us online, there's a question addressed to Mr. Husyev, perhaps. And then again, it pertains to the Mayak plant, and it's about corruption risks involved in asset handover when the plant is privatized. We know that the risks are out there, and Mr. Uruskyy was saying there will be many steering committees to monitor that, and there will be a scenario for collective disresponsibility. Now, when something goes amiss, the director is criminally liable, but when the steering committee is in charge, perhaps there will be no one to be held accountable for corruption. So, in your opinion, what should happen for this negative scenario to be prevented?
I would like to start answering this question. I applied to the law enforcement about a number of issues about intended bankruptcies of companies. And in the Office of Prosecutor General, by our proposal, the working group was created, which investigates the possible violations in the past and also currently happening in Ukroboronprom companies. Number two, responsibility for the decision stays with the management, and supervisory board will have to hire professional, honest managers that have to develop the defense industry. Number three, we have transferred the questions which were about sales of properties into transparent sites. This all happens on Prozoro platform. What about leasing or possible sale of properties? The draft law 3822 says that inside Ukroboronprom, the properties can be transferred from one company to another. Yet, if there is sale outside the group, then it must be on transparent sites after relevant independent assessment of value of such properties. I would like to underline that, to emphasize that corporatization and the large-scale reform of Ukroboronprom is focused on involvement. Rather involvement, not to sell properties. It's about to attract technology and investment. And part of the way towards greater efficiency is transfer some companies to the state property fund. Some of them are in the process of privatization right now. And possible leasing, letting out, or sale of those properties which for decades was never used for the needs of the sector of defense and security. Compliance is very important, as our colleague from Leonardo was saying, to provide for oversight or fulfillment of such procedures. Procurement and sales in a transparent way. That's what we are guided by, because transparency is one of the principles of fighting against corruption.
We know that when this rapid placement of assets starts, there'll be enough supervisors from the civil society and from the international community that will help monitor those transparent platforms, as it calls for serious and fundamental analysis. So I'm urging our international partners present here today. There are many people who are interested in the reform, and that is promising, showing promise that this reform will be kept in rigorous control of the civil society and international community. Let's be watchful, and I'm certain that with NAKO's involvement, we won't be able to go out of focus, and we'll do it together with the civil society and anti-corruption institutions that help us implement the reform. Let's stay hopeful and let us thank all the panelists. Let's thank the participants for their interest in the defense industry. And hopefully very soon we'll be able to boast more investments, we'll showcase success stories and have no corruption scandals to be ashamed of. Very good day to everyone.